The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. Coming up, the East African Savannah is known to be the cradle of humanity. Now researchers are presenting a different history of Homo sapiens, theorizing they evolved all across the continent, including in rainforests as early as 150,000 years ago. I'm Madeline Reynolds of The Best of Our Knowledge. This is The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Madeline Reynolds, in for Lucas Willard. With dangerous predators, extreme weather, and treacherous terrain, it can be hard to survive in a rainforest. That's part of the reason why scientists have believed that the East African Savannah, with its open grasslands and rich soils, is the birthplace of humanity. Yet our next guest's research studied how humans could have actually thrived in rainforests on the African continent 150,000 years ago. To learn more, I spoke with Eleanor Sherry, a professor and head of the Human Paleosystems Group at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology.
This was a time known as the Middle Pleistocene, so it was a late Middle Pleistocene. And humans had been around for like a little while. Humans have emerged between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. And by about 150,000 years ago, we know that humans were the only people around in Africa at this time. So this is how we're saying that these were humans. There's no evidence of any other hominin in Africa during this time. And they seem to have been living in what essentially we call it a wet tropical forest, but this is a type of rainforest in the present day Ivory Coast region, in an area next to a relatively small stream known as the Bete River. So, not a big, scary river that's fast flowing and full of nasty animals, but quite a nice, gentle river that you can imagine would be like a nice place for them to live. And the environment is fairly typical of this sort of lowland rainforest environment. So there are um, typical species like oil palms, and other plants that are essentially like keystone taxa for these sorts of ecosystems. And so, you can imagine humans in a very different environment here to how we picture them in all the dioramas of, early people living in Africa, where you have these, classic Serengeti, savanna environments. So this is something extremely different.
So, scientists have largely believed that our species, Homo sapiens' birthplace, was the East African savannas. But your research challenges that, of course. So, what does this mean for our history that we did not possibly originate just in that one area, in that one environment?
Yes, I mean, I think Eastern Africa has played this outsized role in our understanding of human history because it is an amazing place to work. There's excellent fossil preservation, and some incredible sites have been found there. So, I don't want to knock this area in any way because obviously it is, this incredible place. But I think we also have to pull back a little bit and look at, is this a great place for research because of preservation conditions, or is it literally the only place that people were, and is this the ground zero of human evolution? And when we look at where the fossils and archaeological sites come from in Africa that are relevant to our discussions of human evolution, they come from something ranging between 10 and 25% of Africa. So about 10% of the for the fossils and about 25% for the archaeological sites. So, we're extrapolating for Africa, and on very little, I think, to rule out other regions of Africa, we really need to explore Africa in a more comprehensive way. And then, we would know for sure if, say, a region like Eastern Africa, is this sort of ground zero or not. But the reality so far is that fossils, early fossils that display the sort of earliest indications of the physical features that we associate with contemporary populations come from Southern Africa, they come from Northern Africa, they come from Eastern Africa, so they come from a bunch of different regions. And this seems to suggest that humans evolved from the interactions between a bunch of ancestral populations living in different African regions. And, human evolution is a process. We don't pop out of the ground ready-made. It's a process. It takes time. And I think, the most, to me as an archaeologist, I think the most important thing to think about is actually material culture, because this is where we find the expressions of modern cognition, so the expressions of the human mind. And even though, we don't look exactly the way we do today, that to me doesn't matter as much as are we behaving in a way that is consistent with humans living today. And we see these sorts of behaviors emerge across Africa at more or less the same time as well. So, this suggests that we really need to look at the whole of the African continent if we want to understand human evolution in a more realistic framework.
And is there anything that you can tell us about the, people that lived, 150,000 years ago? Is there anything that you could tell us about maybe their defining characteristics physically, but also kind of just what they did back then?
Yeah, so the constellation of features, physical features that define humans living today, so all contemporary populations, start to emerge in single individuals at some point between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. So that's quite late. And the reason there's sort of such a chronological gap is we just don't have enough fossils to be able to refine it. We talk about having a fossil record from these periods, but actually it's like a time-space palimpsest of different individuals. We don't have fossil populations. So it's very difficult to understand what the degrees of variation were among people living in these times. But if we go back 150,000 years ago, then for sure these people would look pretty different to anybody living today. But I think, these are people would have been able to speak to if we understood their language, would have been able to like empathize with each other, understand each other's lifestyle, and have some kind of understanding as fellow humans. And 150,000 years ago, people were doing pretty cool things in the archaeological record. They were, combining things that don't occur together in nature. So, for example, they were combining stone tips with wooden shafts using glues and resins derived from plant and animal remains, often to specific recipes. So they're doing like a bunch of really interesting things that speak to social cohesion, intelligence, organization, planning, all the sorts of things, that we don't see to this full extent in previous hominin species that were likely ancestral to us. Although we do tend to see them in sort of our sister species like Neanderthals. And what to me is really interesting is with our discovery, we see people not just doing these things in the sort of open environments, but they're in a very closed environment, which is like a really, really different environment for humans to be in. So it's not like at this time we only see people in savannas and grasslands in Africa. People have found them in highlands, they've found them at the edge of deserts, in Sahelian environments, but they're all fundamentally open environments. It's very different if you're living in a dense, tangled jungle where you don't have the visibility, where the fauna is cryptic. So, you don't see the animals are trying to hunt easily, and you might not see like what's coming to hunt you. So it's a very different way of living. And, to me, it sort of speaks to the fundamental human adaptability and that this isn't something we had to learn to become. It's something that we have been for like a really long time.
I'm glad that you kind of touched on, being hunted. You couldn't see the thing coming at you, because my next question was actually about, does the rainforest climate and environment of that time present any, living issues or the chance of it just being hard to survive, for those peoples back then?
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, we've just thought that these kinds of environments were just simply too hostile for people to live in until like certain innovations have been made, including in the most extreme arguments. like required, for example, agriculture, and sort of pointed to studies about modern forest foragers trading with farmers in order to be able to survive in these places. And there were arguments about, maybe there isn't enough food for people to live in there, that the carbohydrates and fats are really sparsely distributed. So how are people going to find them? But there was some pushback and pointing out that, these places can support small bands of hunter-gatherers. And then the emergence of evidence from Asia started to come out, where we saw actually the record in Asian rainforests was going back well beyond farming and also yielded some really interesting insights into how people survived in these places. So, for example, monkey hunting in Sri Lanka and the detoxification of tubers in Borneo, and people seem to have been able to relatively quickly adapt to these environments. So, why not in Africa? Africa to me is actually quite a special case because in Africa you have forest elephants, and forest elephants create trails that are often close to water sources and fruit trees and sources of food that were also suitable for humans. And humans could have easily taken advantage of the fact that there's this really massive herbivore they're sharing these environments with that would have made their lives easier. And they obviously like learn from what these animals, what they can eat and what humans can eat. And what's really interesting about our findings is the material culture looks a little bit different to the material culture that we associate in this time period from the more open environments. It seems to comprise these sort of large heavy duty axe-like tools. I don't know that they were axes, but for want of a better word, there's this heavy duty element. And you wonder, were they clearing trees, or were these used, for example, as to dig out tubers and take advantage of what the forest had to offer. But what we can say is that material culture is different, and this speaks to some kind of adaptation.
I'm Madeline Reynolds. We are speaking with Eleanor Sherry, a professor and head of the Human Paleosystems Group at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, about how modern humans may have benefited from living in West African rainforests as early as 150,000 years ago. I asked Sherry about what sort of objects and artifacts she found in the rainforest to prove human life was there.
We unfortunately don't have any fossils, but we do know that humans were the only species on the landscape capable of producing these kinds of tools. And these quartz tools. And what's interesting is that the sediments that we found them in don't naturally produce quartz. So this quartz had to have been taken to the site. It's not like there's a natural outcrop there that's somehow being bashed and we're mistaking it for stone tools. So um, they're taking these quartz stone tools and they're shaping them into flakes and these sort of like heavy duty elements that I spoke to. And that's essentially what we find, which is a signature of humans being present because we find their stone tools. And of course, when the dates came in, we knew, okay, well, these have to be Homo sapiens because, there is absolutely no evidence of any other hominin being on the scene in Africa 150,000 years ago. But then, of course, the bigger question to us was this a rainforest when these people were present? And this is quite a prescient question because African rainforests are at the limit of rainfall viability for a rainforest. So they receive less rainfall than, say, the Amazon. So even like a small drop in rainfall can really cause forest fragmentation. And so you can imagine in the past, there's a period of forest fragmentation. People move into some newly emerged, grassland environment. They do some stuff, they leave their archaeology, and then it becomes a forest again. And we think they're human in rainforest. So we had to be really careful to prove that it was actually a rainforest when this archaeology was deposited. And we did that in three different ways. So we looked at leaf waxes that are preserved in the soil. So these are these sort of fatty lipid plant remains that are really indestructible. They like last for ages, and you can do some geochemistry on them. And depending on the signature you get from the geochemistry, it will sort of tell you, well, this was largely an open environment, or it was a closed environment, or a wet environment. And we were sort of getting consistently this sort of wet forest signal from these things. But we needed more data to be able to unravel what that really meant. So next we looked at phytoliths, which are these silicified plant remains, so essentially little bits of plants that have become fossilized over time. And from the shape of these things, you can tell, are they grasses or are they trees? So it's kind of broad brush, but straight away we saw that we were getting a lot of trees and not much or no grasses at all. So this was increasingly pointing to forest. And then we thought, okay, well, let's see if we can get any pollen preserved. Is there any pollen preserved here? And we weren't necessarily expecting any pollen to be preserved, but actually there was really good pollen preservation. And from that, then we could actually see what taxa, what plant species we had there. And we straight away could see that we had lots of trees, including these keystone rainforest species, linked to the same layers as the stone tools. So when those stone tools were left there, when people were there leaving those stone tools, they were in a forest.
So, did these peoples or tribes, for a lack of a better term, that lived in the savannas ever cross the paths of the people that lived, on this in this wet tropical environment? And if so, can you explain it? Or were they largely isolated groups?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I would love to know because have traditionally been presented as barriers to human expansion. And when we're thinking about sort of what kind of factors modulate the organization of populations in a landscape, think we look for physical barriers. So like a mountain range separates this group from that group, or like a forest separates this group from that group. But if there are people in the forest, already that does complicate things. Um, we don't have a single case of people living in forest never interacting with people living outside with okay, we talk about uncontacted tribes in South America, but it's complicated. They're not quite ever uncontacted tribes. Um, and so to me, it would seem unlikely that you had people living in grasslands and people living in forests who never encountered each other. But, for sure, they would have been adapted to very different environments and may well have limited the forms of interaction they had. We don't know. But certainly adapting to different ecosystems is what we call a source of population structure. And population structure, what we mean by that are the sort of factors that cause individuals to mate in particular ways. So if you can imagine, have any population of any given animal in a particular location, it's not the case that every individual has the same chance of mating with any other random individual in that group. There are reasons. And with humans, it can be quite complicated. We look at, for example, socioeconomic status affects things, geography affects things. Like there's all kinds of factors that mean that humans are very selective in how they choose to exchange genes. And we think that these sorts of factors were at play at a very early stage in human evolution, and that isolation was a major force of structure in the human past. And it could be that the discovery that we have people living in rainforests at such an early date is a major source of differentiation, of population differentiation, which is important because if you have population differentiation, you have genetic diversity, and genetic diversity is the best way to ensure long-term success of any overall population. And of course, we have been very successful as a species. And part of that is, we evolved in a very big continent. We didn't have to deal with ice ages. We had a lot of genetic diversity. And I think overall, the overall population size of Homo sapiens was much bigger than, say, that of Neanderthals.
I've been speaking with Eleanor Sherry, a professor and head of the Human Paleosystems Group at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, about the evolution of Homo sapiens on the continent of Africa. I believe you and your colleagues, and I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Enyama?
Yeah.
Okay, in the Ivory Coast. So, why did you go there and what did you discover? Did you have any challenges?
Yeah. I was interested initially in West Africa because of this whole question of needing to explore the whole of the African continent if we want to understand human evolution in this more realistic framework, right? And West Africa is one of the least explored regions. When I started working there around 2014, we knew very, very little about it. But of course, there were still archaeological sites that had been discovered, and there were still some really amazing pioneering West African researchers who were trying to kind of find out more about the region. But traditionally, being sort of like not been given a lot of attention because people just felt it was too far from the main stage of human evolution to be relevant, and also because many of these sites hadn't been dated or hadn't been dated convincingly or properly. And I came across this report that had been published in Russian that related to excavations in the 80s and the 90s, this joint Ivorian Soviet mission that had excavated this site called Anyama. And they reported significant sediment depth and archaeology that looked old, but they weren't really able to date it. And it, because it had been published in Russian, no one in the English speaking world had really been like aware of that it existed. And, so all of these things piled on each other to mean that, no one really knew about the site. Was it West Africa? Was it Russian? Like happened a long time ago. But I came across this report thanks to a colleague who could actually speak Russian, and had written a summary about it that I came across. And we got in touch with the professor who had originally, well, there were two professors. There was a Soviet professor, sadly now passed away, um, and the Ivorian professor had been doing a PhD with the Soviet professor. And he is in his 80s, but thankfully, his memory was amazing, and he was really excited to go back. And we proposed, how about we sort of reopen investigations? You've excavated a lot of the site, you've found a lot of stone tools. There's been a lot of reporting on the stone tools and stratigraphy, but what they lacked was a chronology and anything linking the stone tools with a sort of an ecosystem story. So I feel that our work was really a continuation of the excellent work that was started in the 80s and the 90s by this group. So we went back with Professor Gere and completed the work essentially. And it's fantastic that he was able to sort of get closure on this site that he'd worked on from his PhD like decades later. And so that's how we ended up investigating this site in the Ivory Coast.
So, what did you find there, and what did this help you with in your research and study?
Well, I think there's two takeaway points. So, when we started working in West Africa, there was nothing thought to be older than 30, 40,000 years ago. So it was like a young chronology, and that was part of the reason why everybody thought West Africa didn't really matter. That people got there kind of fairly late, so it's not really going to tell us much about the human story. Um, but we obviously pushed it back to 150,000, which is now like one of two sites in West Africa, the other site being investigated by my colleague Khadine Young in Senegal, and they both have ages of 150,000, and neither of them come from a grassland environment. One is like a mangrove forest, and one is a rainforest. So we have significantly pushed back the age of human presence in West Africa. So that's also really important. And this is just scratching the surface. So this is the first, my project is the first project to really, focus on human evolution across a West African transect. And almost immediately we're finding stuff that is much older than anyone supposed. So who knows how much older we're going to push this record back to. So that's exciting. And of course, the other exciting point is the ecological diversity story, because there's this idea that the savannah is the cradle of our species. So even if we move away from a single geographic origin hypothesis, we still like these cradle stories. So East Africa's the cradle. Okay, maybe all of Africa was the cradle, but it's the savannah. It's savannas across. And we're sort of breaking down those narratives and saying, well, actually, um, there's a lot of ecological and spatial complexity to our origins in Africa, and this definitely has to be part of the human story and something that explains our incredible flexibility to adapt to all kinds of different environments, and including now gunning for Mars. I feel like this is part of that story.
Right. And with any of the tools and objects that you found, did it lead to any predictions that you and your colleagues had about possibly what these people did? You mentioned that, they had these quartz tools. So did they like work on quartz? Like, was that something that they possibly did?
Yeah, so quartz is a sort of dominant local raw material in that area. So if you want to make a stone tool, you're sort of limited to using quartz over there because there isn't any other sort of suitable nappable rock. But what's interesting is these sort of large cutting tools, these axe like heavy duty tools in the assemblage, have been found in other regions of Africa where there is forest today. And, colleagues have argued that perhaps the development of these big chunky tool types is something to do with living in forested environments. But for a range of reasons, no one was really able to prove that because they couldn't date them or because they couldn't associate the stone tools with any environment. I have to say, working in rainforests is incredibly hard. Preservation conditions are awful, especially for organic remains. So we've been really, really lucky, and it's been such a special site to be able to have the combination of sediment depth and the preservation of both the stone tools and the ecological information that we could, stitch together. But yes, it does, it's probably a more widespread phenomenon. And I think, as time goes by, obviously now we've given people a reason to invest in searching for these things, whereas before it was like, don't bother wasting your research money on this. You know, um, and I think it's validated a lot of colleagues and researchers in the past who have tried to argue that evidence like this would one day appear. So that's, really fantastic.
Yeah. And finally, what are you excited to research and study and maybe excavate into next when it comes to this whole entire topic?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we want to understand how much further the record goes back in West Africa. So not just in rainforest, but generally, how far does it go back? And, what's the nature of the transition between hominins in the region who are not Homo sapiens and the first Homo sapiens to get there? This is a tough question to ask. And of course, are we going to find any fossils? So we're trying to target regions that may have fossils, so looking in caves and rock shelters and trying to find areas where like the soil isn't too acidic, that it's going to, break down organic remains because it is a problem in vast stretches of West Africa. So, we were in Ghana, we're in Nigeria. We're looking at like a bunch of different areas, and I think, we're all very excited about what could possibly come next.
Eleanor Sherry is a professor and head of the Human Paleosystems Group at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology. Her research into humans in rainforests on the African continent 150,000 years ago was originally published in the journal Nature. If you'd like to tell the best of our knowledge what you think, send us an email at knowledge@wamc.org. You can listen to the best of our knowledge anytime as a podcast, downloadable wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to catch up on past episodes or hear more WAMC National Productions programs on the news, academic study, books, women's issues, the media, and the environment, visit WAMCpodcasts.org. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1807. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to Lucas Willard. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Madeline Reynolds.